We ring this bell as we do every Sunday. The first bell we ring is to bring us back into covenant. We are on the unceded land of the Muwekma tribe of the Ohlone people. They were displaced, colonized, their land taken. Now they seek to regain their land as well as pass on their heritage, customs, and culture to their descendants. Everything that we do to help them restore their rights, equality, and sovereignty helps work our way back into covenant. The second bell we ring is to call us back into relationship with ourselves and with one another, to recognize broken promises or unhealed hurt or lingering scars where being right was more important than being in right relationship. We intentionally gather to create an ever-widening circle of compassion, commitment, and solidarity until we are all beloved to one another. And the third bell calls us into relationship with our children and our children's children out to the seventh generation, reminding us that what we do or fail to do today will be felt by those who come after us.
Good morning. Today we'll be talking about the history of the Muwekma tribe of the Ohlone people. One of the goals of this tribe is trying to recover their cultural practices. And what do they look like? In the book, Love at the Center, that we have been using to introduce some of our services, there's an essay by Reverend Karen Van Fossen entitled, Love is Abolition, in which she records her experiences in an Indian-led environment at the Water Protector Movement at Sharing Rock in North Dakota in 2016. In the community of protesters, people provided housing in the forms of tents, teepees, yurts, and RVs. They even asked people to leave their housing behind for new people that might come when they left. They provided health care in the form of acupuncture, emergency medical aid, and herbs. They provided inclusion and access to care for disabled people so that they could participate in decision-making. There was elder care, whereby the elders were served first food, housing, and health care, and socializing, and the rideshare were all free. A sort of basic guaranteed income and sustainable living wage jobs in the form of contributing to the community without money required. All of this gives us a vision of what indigenous communities were and might again be. One of the leaders described the camp as a place where you come in, you are a family. When you're at home, that's your family, that's your love, that's where love was. I can see why the Muwekma and other indigenous people long to create their cultural practices. It sounds a lot like Love at the Center. So we're now going to do the chalice lighting. So please join me in reciting these words, which call us together as a community and with Unitarian Universalists all across the globe. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love.
Good morning. My name's Beth Schaefer, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm a member of the board. We'd like to welcome you here this morning, and we have some announcements and a little information for you. The first announcement, I'm going to ad-lib a little bit, but this is really important information. The Fremont City Council is considering a measure that would criminalize being homeless, basically. It would allow unhoused people to be arrested for camping, meaning tents, living in their car, etc. And this is something that is clearly goes against our principles and values. On the 4th of February, which is Tuesday, a week from this Tuesday, so a week and a half from now, the City Council will have the meeting at which they vote, and we are urging everyone to try to write a letter ahead of time, to try to come to the meeting. If you've got a purple t-shirt, wear your purple Mission Peak t-shirt so it's clear what a contingent we have. And some of us will be speaking at the council meeting as well. So watch for more information this week, please, and take that step and write a letter, show up at the meeting. This is really something that meshes very much with what we want to do. So if you're our guest for the first time, we welcome you. Here's a bit of information on how our hybrid services work. We use chat in Zoom or our book near the welcome table to share joys and concerns. These are personal milestones of importance, which will be read aloud in the service. We also have social hour after the service, where we get to visit with one another in breakout rooms or on the patio. The worship host will give you more information about this immediately after the service. Someone from our membership team will put a link to our weekly newsletter in chat so those folks on Zoom can see all our events coming up. We encourage you to join anything that speaks to you. We also put our welcome email, welcome@mpuuc.org, to request a newsletter or other information be sent to you. If you're here in person, our welcome table is right over there by the door where you came in, where you can sign up to receive a newsletter or ask any other questions you may have. Please make sure your mobile devices are silenced, and we're so glad to be together today. Let's end by asking everyone in Zoomlandia and everyone in Cole Hall to wave to one another and feel the joy of being one large, beloved community. Welcome and thank you to the friends far and near.
Listen more often to things 'tis the ancestors' breath in the voice of the waters. Those who have died have never, never left. The dead have a part with the living. They are in the woman's breast, they are in the wailing child. They are with us in our homes, they are with us in this crowd. The dead have a part with the living. So listen more often to things than to meanings. Listen more often to things than to meanings. 'Tis the ancestors' breath when the fire's voice is heard. 'Tis the ancestors' breath in the voice of the waters.
I'm here today as a guest on land that was stolen from the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations, land that many other tribal nations thought of as home before those relationships were written over by settler colonialism. So land acknowledgments like this have become pretty commonplace at the beginning of events, at universities, sometimes in our email signatures, but I've always found them to be kind of confusing. Like, once you admit something is stolen, aren't you supposed to give it back? So if there's anyone listening who has a couple hundred spare acres that you're feeling guilty about, just contact your local tribal government. We would be happy to relieve you of that burden. That's probably not you, right? Maybe you've heard of this movement to return land to indigenous people, but you're thinking, I can barely afford rent. What is it I'm supposed to be giving back? That's what I want to clarify today. Because not only is getting land back in indigenous hands in your best interests, and the best interests of the land itself, there's ways anyone can help make it happen. I'm a descendant of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, which is part of the Anishinaabe Nation of the Great Lakes region. Home, for me, is also the Pacific Northwest. I grew up on Kalapuya and Molalla territory, and now I'm a professor of Indigenous Studies at CSU. My ancestors worked very hard to navigate a complex and changing world that was ravaged by settler colonialism. My grandma and both of her parents survived the trauma and abuse of the Indian boarding school system. The generation before them fought to keep our tribe from being terminated by the federal government. Going even further back, my 6 times great-grandfather's signature is on the 1863 Treaty of Old Crossing, which forced the Anishinaabe to give up 11 million acres of what's now Minnesota in exchange for a little over $400,000 and a 640-acre reservation. That works out to about 5 cents an acre, which has to be one of the worst land deals in U.S. history. This sort of thing happened all over the U.S. and Canada. The problem isn't just that settlers showed up and took the land, it's how they've treated it ever since. That land we lost in Minnesota, the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline goes right through the middle of it. That freaking pipeline is responsible for the largest inland oil spill ever recorded in the US. And now, they're trying to expand it. Whether we're talking pipelines or some other industry, the colonial mindset has been about extracting resources, mostly with the goal of making the rich richer. But that's why land back is not about indigenous people trying to run a real estate scam. We're doing this because the land itself is in crisis. Every indigenous culture is unique, but our shared philosophy is that we come from the land and the land is what sustains us. And therefore, we have a responsibility to care for it. Land Back is about reasserting indigenous relationships with the land. Relationships that are based on tens of thousands of years of hands-on experience taking care of our homelands. If you've ever tried your hand at farming or gardening, you know that land management takes more than just showing up with good intentions. Globally, indigenous people are really good at managing for biodiversity and resilient ecosystems. That's because we've had generation upon generation to test out what works and what doesn't. There's tons of evidence and examples to back this up. One recent study showed that indigenous people make up just 5% of the global population, but we're managing nearly half the areas on Earth that are protected for conservation or still support intact ecosystems. Land Back is about radically rethinking how we relate to the land and other living beings. So, look up whose land you're on. Some tribes, like the Ohlone and Duwamish, have a way for you to pay a voluntary land tax on their website as a way to recognize that you're a guest on their homeland. Way easier than dealing with the IRS. Or maybe you do own land, but you need to live there for now. You can set up a bequest in your will so that your estate goes back to the tribe. I'm not saying that any of this is easy. Unsettling is hard work, especially in places where indigenous people were removed or erased. That absence tends to be papered over with the myth that colonialism worked, Native people disappeared, so there's nothing to worry about. But when I look at my own family's history, the government that took our land and outlawed our ceremonies, the boarding schools that took our language, the epidemic of sexual violence that has touched nearly every Native woman in my family. All of these concerted efforts to end the story of us as Anishinaabe people. And yet, despite all that, we're still here. Our survival as Indigenous people is a miracle. And the point of miracles is that they inspire action. I think if we're honest as human beings, we know that this path we're on is both morally untenable and ecologically unsustainable. Land Back is a call to action. To get real that the current system is only really working for an increasingly smaller group of folks. But when the people who are benefiting from this legacy of stolen land step forward, real change can happen. This isn't just an opportunity to right a past injustice, it's the only way to heal the land itself. And that means a better future for everyone. Thank you.
Good morning. When we ring our bell 3 times to bring us into right relationships, one of those times is to remind us that we are on the unceded land of the Ohlone people. The Ohlone, also known as Costanoans by Spanish invaders in the 18th century, was comprised of approximately 50 tribes from San Francisco Bay through Monterey Bay and Salinas. One of these tribes, the Verona Band, were the Ohlone people from what is now Alameda County, including the Fremont area where Mission Peak UC is located. The Verona Band was a federally recognized tribe from 1906 until 1927, when the federal government, without significant evidence, declared the band no longer existed. The Muwekma Ohlone applied for federal recognition as genetically proven ancestors of the Verona tribe, again in 2002, and were denied. The group continues to work toward federal recognition. They participate in archaeologic projects to establish a link between the Ohlone of today and their pre-contact ancestors. Members promote awareness and understanding of history, language, and culture. They promote educational programs in schools and libraries and museums. They coordinate access to land for cultural practices and ceremonies, including powwows and traditional dance. They work to revitalize the tribe's language and protect sacred sites and their ancestral homeland. The Muwekma Culture and Language Fund website states that they are in the process of revitalizing the language, songs, traditions, dances, regalia, native plant restoration and identification, food and cultivation for culture, and educational workshops for children, tribe members, and the general public. Please give generously to the Muwekma Culture and Language Fund. Thank you.
We take up a collection to support the Muwekma Ohlone Heritage Fund to acknowledge a great injustice that first occurred 170 years ago and has been reinforced in a myriad of acts of exclusion, erasure, and oppression. Although we weren't alive to be directly responsible for this violence and theft that began the process, we bear witness to the variety of ways that such theft is excused, overlooked, and normalized, which results in our complicity with the theft of land and livelihood. It's also becoming more and more obvious that continuing to support this settler-colonial model is working against our best interests. The Muwekma are a landless tribe whose families enrolled with the Bureau of Indian Affairs from 1928 to 1971 and attended Indian boarding schools in the 1930s and 40s. Scattered throughout the Bay Area, they lacked common communal places to preserve their traditions, language, and dances, which spread to other communities during the 1870s. The tribe is now revitalizing their culture through workshops on language, songs, traditions, dances, regalia, native plant restoration, and cultivation. Our donations will support these efforts. If you can make a donation using the bill option in your online banking, or you can drop a check in the Mission Peak mail slot, or you can pay online with a credit or debit card. Thank you for supporting the Muwekma Ohlone tribal leaders and their efforts to sustain their heritage and approaches to care for the land. Your contributions make loving, learning, and compassionate leadership more possible. Thank you.
The covenant which binds us and holds us together is with more than a regional tribe. It's with more than the Fremont City Council and the unhoused people who call Fremont their home. It is also with us who rely on one another to be there to share important milestones or hold our hand in hardship. If you have a joy or concern that might create a sense of connection or solidarity that would be meaningful and help you along in the week ahead, we invite you to write it in the book on the table over there, very short. Write your name, whether it's a joy or a concern, and we will share it aloud. If you're with us in person or online, please type it into the chat. By sharing these joys and concerns, we create a network of mutuality between members and friends and make life more meaningful for everyone. If you would like to place a stone silently in our stone garden while the music plays, we invite you to do that. And of course, if you would like to have a more personal conversation with either Reverend Barber or myself, we would love to talk to you.
Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Mystery, mystery, is a riddle and a mystery. Where do we come from? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Where
Life is a riddle and a mystery.
That was lovely. Immigration today. For all of these concerns and the joy that we hold in our heart for one another and the promise of a brighter future, we promise to keep our minds, our hearts, our doors, and our arms open.
Good morning. My name's Terry King. Along with the rest of Mission Peak's Anti-Racism, Anti-Oppression Committee, also known as ARO, I've been trying to learn more about the history of the Ohlone people and their fight for federal recognition as a tribe. Learning more seems like an appropriate first step towards helping to find justice for the Muwekma, the original inhabitants of the Tri-Cities. So since last summer, ARO has met with Charlene Nijme, the chairwoman of the Muwekma, and Matt Ricciazzi, a member of her staff. We've also talked with Alan Leventhal, who is an anthropologist who has for decades been trying to help the Muwekma document their claim, and we have read a lot. When I started this endeavor, I expected it to be straightforward. I figured better understanding would quickly surface right next steps. Friends, that is not the case. I thought I'd find answers, but instead, I've just found more questions. Consider. Our white ancestors repeatedly negotiated in bad faith. They barbarically slaughtered indigenous people well into the 20th century. Reading the details has been disturbing. I wonder, will our species ever stop committing atrocities? To deny, excuse, justify, or ignore the past only perpetuates the harm. Throughout California history, the colonizers held profoundly different worldviews than the indigenous peoples. With little or no attempt at respect, they dismissed native people as subhuman and purposely decimated them. Will we ever learn how to interact with people who are different than we are, with interest, kindness, and honor? Tribal recognition is the path to much-needed social benefits such as healthcare and education support, as well as access to ancestors' remains and sacred objects that are currently warehoused in museums. Getting recognition is hard. The framework that the Bureau of Indian Affairs uses to determine the legitimacy of a tribe seems quite flawed to me, perhaps even intentionally obstructive. Would it be possible to adopt more effective guidelines that better match the complexity of the situation? Gaming rights. They are the economic cornerstone of the benefits that come with tribal recognition. This topic is a polarizing, politicized third rail, and I find myself troubled. Whether gaming is a good or an ill, it's both. It's complicated. It is arguably the most valuable form of reparations that have ever been offered. And the historic linking of gaming rights to tribal recognition, this offer of a regional monopoly over a very lucrative business that might provide for the well-being of the tribe, that linking of gaming rights has created competition and painful divisiveness amongst Native groups, and that breaks my heart. I wholly respect the Muwekma's insistence on receiving the same rights that other tribes have been granted, and I think they deserve better. Wanting good for all, how do we best support their sovereignty? For myriad reasons, internal relationships among California indigenous peoples have become fragmented. Tribal groups compete with one another, and families have been torn apart. People suffer from poverty, lack of opportunity, and discrimination. How will the Ohlone heal from prolonged and massive injustice? And what is my role as a non-Indigenous person in righting past wrongs? California's colonization has left us with a very complicated, messy modern-day situation. There are no easy answers. But that doesn't mean we can throw up our hands. People of goodwill cannot morally ignore history or ongoing injustice. But it will take humility and determination to learn how to be allies for the Muwekma and to transform our weekly land acknowledgement from mere words into right action. Let us ask ourselves, what is loving? What is fair?
That was quite lovely. We ring this bell 3 times. The first is to call us back into covenant. We are on the unceded land of the Mohawk tribe of the Ohlone people. They were displaced, colonized, their land taken. Now they seek to regain their land as well as to pass on their heritage, customs, and culture to their descendants. Everything that we do to help restore their rights, equality, and sovereignty is working our way back into covenant. Anyone who's attended our services here in the last 4 years have heard this. Some of you are lucky enough to have heard it hundreds of times. The purpose of this service today is to unpack this statement and consider why we say what we say, how it got to be this way, to whom we make this acknowledgement, and explore really what it asks of us. According to some Aboriginal historians, land acknowledgements actually go back thousands of years. That said, countries with a colonial mindset of expanding empire and those where major corporate interests are focused on extracting resources, these countries tend to come later into the game. The first industrialized country to explore land acknowledgements, anybody want to guess? Australia in the 1970s. Canada followed shortly after that in the 1980s. The U.S. began showing some interest in the 1990s and early 2000s. Unitarian Universalism began to look more closely at land acknowledgements starting around 2010. In a minute, I'll talk a little bit about what I remember coming across some of that. But first, I want to talk to you about what makes it so hard for the dominant culture to recognize land acknowledgements. Why do some people feel that they are perfunctory or performative, or at best, a painkiller for the liberal moral conscience? I want to start by acknowledging that land acknowledgements go against the pervasive grain of dominant culture conditioning that we receive from a very early age if we're raised in this country. Subtle reassurances that come to us that remind us that if we're born into the dominant culture, we are divinely placed into a system that has ever so carefully been slanted in our favor. It is our obligation to recognize and uphold this favor. I want to start with one small but memorable way that this happened for me in my upbringing, one that you might be familiar with if you had any kind of similar upbringing to the one that I did. How many people here, and I hope you can be honest, even though we are actually speaking about atrocities to the Indian people, but how many people here grew up playing or watching the game Cowboys and Indians? For a few summers, when I was approximately 8 or 9 years old, Cowboys and Indians was the game of choice on sunny summer afternoons. I think I remember it being based on some popular Western TV show of the time, which I can't remember the title. But what I do remember quite vividly is feeling the tremendous conflict in my stomach when it came the moment where we got into picking sides. Now, no TV Western seemed necessary to convey to those playing that there was bias built into this game. A rule book wasn't necessary to understand how to play because there were really only 2 rules for how the game goes. Rule number 1, Cowboys win. Rule number 2, if you're chosen to play an Indian, see rule number 1. The problem, at least as my dad explained it to me, was that I always chose to be an Indian. And after so many countless rounds of playing an Indian, I came to a place in the game where I started arguing about the rules with what felt like a circuit court made up entirely of cowboys. And after the umpteenth time of getting nowhere with my cowboy colleagues, I ran with tears to my dad's consolation. Before I share with you what he told me then, you need to know what he told me a few years before. You are an Indian, my father said to me and my brother, rather matter-of-factly, one afternoon. Really? My brother and I sputtered. Really, he said. I am 1/8 Cherokee. That makes you 1/16. It was shared with us sometime during a short stint where my dad, my brother, and I were participating in the YMCA program, Indian Guides. Anybody ever hear of that? Oh, it was an interesting program. By the way, we were the Cloud family, and I took great pride in our family being the Cloud family. My dad was Red Cloud, my brother was Thunder Cloud, I was Rain Cloud. I don't know if that says anything, but we quit a year or so after starting because my dad began feeling like we were taking Indian culture and turning it into a charade. My dad explained that even though he was told that he was Cherokee, he didn't grow up with any kind of Cherokee culture. In fact, it was kind of the opposite. My dad was dropped off at his grandparents' home when he was an infant. His grandfather, who raised him, told him about being Cherokee when he was about the age that we were when we were in Indian Guides. But it was never explained to my dad from which relative that heritage came. So it was always a little bit of a mystery. He grew up in northern Texas near the Oklahoma border. His grandparents moved there because someone discovered oil nearby, which led to a widespread land reallocation. They moved there hoping to get rich. That never happened. We asked our dad why he never told us about being Cherokee or why he never talked about it, and he said that his grandparents told him not to. He explained that people in the town where he grew up treated you different if they knew you were Cherokee. That's why he told me, the day that I came to him crying, that every time that he played cowboys and Indians when he was a boy, he always made sure that he was a cowboy. I told him that I didn't want to live like that, even though it became clear that my team would never win. He told me I was braver than he was, but seeing how hurt I felt, he consoled me. Maybe they'll change, he said, but that never happened either. There's more to that story, but let's fast forward a little, 50 years forward, to the time I was called here to serve Mission Peak as its minister. By the time I arrived here, I had gotten a little more education and experienced a little more of what dominant culture is and how it learns to express itself. I graduated college with a minor in Third World Studies. I studied immigration and westward expansion in the U.S. I was taught anti-oppression when I attended Starr King School for the Ministry. During my first ministry in Atlanta, I took a summer to travel the Trail of Tears from my congregation to the town where my dad grew up. The Trail of Tears, if you're not familiar, is the trail that Andrew Jackson led the Cherokee people when he was removing them from Georgia and gave them a reservation in Oklahoma. I listened when Anishinaabe activist Winona LaDuke came and gave the keynote address at the 2010 General Assembly and asked UUs to, quote, decolonize ourselves. Like many who attended the 2012 GA in Phoenix, I began unpacking what was meant in the doctrine of discovery, the 15th century papal decree which granted early explorers the right to, quote, discover, end quote, territories and tribes of people in the New World, and give those explorers rights to claim the territory for kings of foreign lands, even if the land that they were claiming was already occupied. The main premise being that the occupants, if they weren't Christian, were savages and wouldn't know how to steward the land. I remember clearly at the 2012 GA being taught this by an indigenous leader who mentioned with great pride that despite not having ever read a Bible before the explorers arrived, they didn't need discovering. They were quite clear about who they were. I remember how one of the speakers who grew up in an indigenous community in America resonated with a quote that she had heard from Bishop Desmond Tutu about African tribes welcoming missionaries. Bishop Tutu explained, when the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bibles and we had the land. They said, let us pray, and we closed our eyes. And when we opened them, we had the Bibles and they had the land. If you really study the history of settler colonialism in the Americas, you will understand that the vast capture of land in this country was accompanied by the genocide of many different autonomous and sovereign indigenous tribes. When European settlers arrived in the Americas, historians estimate that there were roughly 10 million Native Americans living here. By 1900, following general policies of the U.S.'s westward expansion that included forced assimilation of native peoples and the annexation of their land, their estimated population fell from 10 million to just under 300,000. Even when this was done peacefully, it came with duplicity and coercion. During the first 100 years of the United States' existence, approximately 370 treaties were ratified regarding transfer of land. Most historians agree that the U.S. government broke the vast majority of these treaties. The result was not only permanent loss of tribal lands and sacred burial grounds, but extensive cultural disruption and pervasive economic hardship. California in the 1750s had an indigenous population of approximately 300,000. When the Spanish and Mexican empires arrived to establish the mission system, one which we have just up the street, the population within indigenous tribes declined from forced labor, disease, cultural disruption, and the first wave of genocide. The second wave of genocide came with a concerted effort of U.S. westward expansion, which began in the late 1840s. Someone whose name we might recognize was a major player. Even before the gold rush of 1949, U.S. Army surveyor John C. Fremont was sent to secure ports of trade that we could exchange with Asia. He came back east after these visits, recruiting thousands of people to migrate and settle in the West, despite having no treaties with either the Spanish or indigenous people. The 1925 book, Handbook of the Indians of California, estimated that California's indigenous population decreased roughly from 150,000 in 1948 to 30,000 in 1870. That's only 22 years. And it was down to 16,000 in 1900. Again, it was a combination of disease, low birth rates, enslavement, starvation, loss of culture, and genocide. It is through this timeline that we must look carefully to understand this particular land's ancestral lineage. In the late 1800s, the Muwekma Ohlone tribe were still settled on this land. They were a recognized tribe within the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Mission Peak Unitarian Universalist Congregation and the city of Fremont are located within the unceded ethno-historic territory of the ancestral Alston, Tamian, Tuiban tribal lands of the intermarried Muwekma, Tamian, and Chechenyo Ohlone-speaking tribes who were colonized in the Santa Clara and San Jose missions. In 1910, the Muwekma Ohlone were recognized as a landless tribe referred to as the Verona Band because they were associated with the Verona rail station that was built nearby. But in 1930, an agent from the Bureau of Indian Affairs mistakenly reported that the Verona Band was no longer viable. This same agent was fired a year later for what is believed to be incompetence and corruption, common among agents tasked with providing services to Indian communities. But ever since this disastrous mistake, the Muwekma Ohlone have had archaeologists trying desperately to research their ancestry. And such research has produced a mountain of evidence to reestablish their status as a recognized tribe. But the BIA has repeatedly refused to recognize them. What it comes down to is the BIA and state legislators effectively pitting tribes against one another, establishing in them the belief that they are in competition for lucrative gaming rights, which other recognized tribes have gotten. Legislators have inferred that if the Muwekma are willing to sign away their claim to gaming rights, they would be granted recognition. But they refuse to compromise their integrity or their sovereignty. The problem is, without recognition, tribal leaders are denied access to the over 12,000 tribal artifacts in possession of museums. They are denied access to their sacred burial grounds and to the repository of eagle feathers necessary for many of their rituals, not to mention access to education and health care benefits that come with recognized status. When I came to Mission Peak and noticed that we didn't have a land acknowledgement in our services or in any part of our process as a congregation, I wanted to change that. And I think it is important to understand that my motivation didn't come from being Indian, because I am not. At almost exactly the same time that I was being called as minister here in this congregation, I was working on updating my own ancestral research. I signed up with 23andMe to get my genetic and anthropological heritage. Some of the results I received confirmed what I expected. Some, however, were a surprise. From my mom's side, I learned that I was 50% Ashkenazi Jew, which I knew. My father's side was entirely Scottish and English. No Indian heritage whatsoever. 100% cowboy. Further research revealed that in the 100 years between the 1830s and the 1930s, it was quite common for residents in North Texas and western Oklahoma to claim Cherokee heritage because that gave them an advantage in being awarded land rights when land was reallocated during the oil boom. It turns out the dominant culture will even claim Indian heritage if it helps them gain land once promised to treaties to Indian tribes. I wanted a land acknowledgement, not out of guilt or interest in moral posturing. I wanted it because I no longer believed it was possible to achieve spiritual liberation as long as we remain more loyal to our privilege than to our sense of honesty and accountability. I talked about covenant in the land acknowledgement, not out of a connection with the Ohlone people. At the time I proposed doing this, we actually had no relationship with the Ohlone people, although I always hoped we could develop one. The covenant I referred to in the land acknowledgement is with ourselves, with our integrity, from a commitment to see ourselves honestly, the good, the bad, and the ugly. To be accountable when we learn harm was done to their ancestors by our ancestors, harm from which we continue to benefit. As our relationship with the Ohlone develops, it is important that our acknowledgement and covenant are more than just words, more than moral self-flagellation. We asked tribal leaders what we could do to help them restore their sovereignty. They responded, "Write a letter to the BIA advocating for inclusion as a recognized tribe. This we have done with a letter from the board to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They asked us to put a statement of advocacy for the tribe on our website. This we have done. They asked us to contribute money to the tribe's efforts to restore their culture and their heritage. We continue, and part of the Share the Plate is for this purpose. And they asked us to continue to educate ourselves and be in relationship with them by attending their annual powwow in Santa Clara each year in May. This we plan to do. So friends, let us acknowledge that this connection to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe that stewarded these lands from between 3,000 and 10,000 years before we arrived on the continent is an important connection. Because if we are totally honest, it all really just comes down to a choice for ourselves as well as for this land. We can adopt the dominant settler colonial attitude, which is coming back with a vengeance in this new administration. But this just points us all down a dark, duplicitous political road of power grabbing committed to helping the wealthy extract as much from the people and the land as possible. And I think we deserve more than that. We can choose a path of humble stewardship and an interdependent commitment to sustainability with our planet and all of its people. May we choose our people and our promises wisely. Amen, and blessed be.
We are going, heaven knows where we are going, but we don't live, and we will get there. Heaven knows how we will get there, but we know we will. It will be hard, we know, and the road will be muddy and rough, but we'll get there. Heaven knows how we will get there, but we know we will. Ooh, yeah, yeah. Ooh, yeah, yeah. Ooh, yeah, yeah. Ooh, yeah, yeah. We are going. Heaven knows where we are going, but we know it is. And we will get there. Heaven knows how we will get there, and we know we will. Ooh, yeah, yeah. 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 Ooh, yeah,
Please join with me in reciting the words on this that will appear on the screen to extinguish our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Friends, hand on your heart, one reaching out to the world. Be wary of the world of cowboys. Rugged individualism is not going to save us. We will be saved when we connect ourselves, one and all, with each other and with a sense of sustainability, care, and love. May that be a practice we endeavor in everything that we do, everyone that we meet, and everywhere we go. From this day forward, amen.